In my title, I used the term keystone, and keystone really, a keystone species is really a species which has a disproportionate large effect on its environment relative to its abundance. And as many of you guys know, you go out in the bush about in Alberta, and aspen is everywhere. So it's not really a species which is not very abundant. It's there, it's in Alberta. But if you go just beyond Manitoba and you go in the boreal forest there, aspen becomes actually quite rare in the general boreal forest. So it plays different roles in different positions in different forests. Also in Alberta, we have forest types. If you go up in the foothills, for example, towards Jasper, you will notice that aspen is kind of dropping out of the plant communities or forest communities, and there it plays very special roles in nutrient cyclings and so on in these upper foothill forests. The other term ecologists use for special species is the term foundational species. And I think in the boreal in Alberta, in the mixed wood forest, aspen is probably a foundation species. It has it has a disproportionate effect on the community, and it is key to the resilience of that community. And I'm coming back to the term resilient in a bit in my presentation, but it plays a characteristic role, and as many of you guys know, aspen stands, when they burn, they recover back to aspen stands, and that's kind of the resiliency aspen can give us. Similar with our pine species, lodgepole pine and jack pine after fire, after natural disturbances. Before I get started, you guys will get a broad overview of some of the things I've been doing. I've been working with aspen for over 20 years. And this is just a small portion of the people who have been involved in the research over the years, and some of my colleagues. These are some of the current sponsors of my research, but I've worked with lots of forest companies over the last years. They have been part of this, and I guess we call it now AESRD, so things change since then. Within weeks, I guess, things change really quickly. So, now, reclamation, we have a reclamation crowd here, so I want to talk and put it into context of reclamation, what I'm going to talk about today. In the past, and in certain areas, reclamation was more of a strategy of maintaining a site, stabilization a site to really, after an industrial disturbance happened, to get something green back on the site. That was one of the main objectives initially 20, 30, 50 years ago if there was a bigger disturbance. Many of these approaches were crop or single species approaches. It was not a community. It was not about function and all these kind of things we're going to talk about today. It was more or less, can we grow something on it, and if it grows, it's good, we can walk away kind of thing. And on top of that, it was a soil-centered approach. It was mostly, can we create a soil or a substrate where the vegetation can grow, and once the vegetation grows, we walk away. So we didn't really look at the overall connections between soils and plants. And that has changed in the last 10 or so, 15 years, that also government regulations stipulates that we have to, or areas have to be restored to fully functional and sustainable ecosystems in time and space. So if there was a forest and we want to recreate a forest after disturbance, that forest has to be not in the same composition of the previous forest, but it has to have a similar function as that original forest. So one of the functions would mean if that reclaimed forest burns down, it has to recover on its own. You cannot go out back and plant trees everywhere because nature never planted trees. Okay? So the system has to be set up. So what are parts of functional ecosystems? Well, some of the characteristics are structures and functions. And structures would be a forest has a canopy, it has a shrub layer, it has a moss layer and herbs. So and that would be the vertical structure. So that is part of a forest, it's a vertical structure. We also have species diversity. We have different tree species, we have different shrub species, herbs and mosses and so on, and that part is important. We cannot have just single species. The spatial arrangement of those species on the landscape and or in the stand is also important. Like I already mentioned, the one aspen tree in a sea of lodgepole pine will have an effect on that area around that aspen tree. It will behave differently. You will have different vegetation growing underneath that aspen. And as many of you guys know, soils and forest floor development is very different depending on which choices you make. And we'll talk a bit more about that. And all these structural parts are related also to function. What functions do these forests have? Well, one of the main function is, well, we want the forests to grow, not necessarily for 2x4s and things like that, but we want them to grow, so they have to be productive. They can have high productivity or low productivity, but they have to grow. Okay? They have important functions as cycling of gases, water, and nutrients. Those things need to cycle, and those functions are important and need to be created or maintained. Part of that is decomposition. Trees die, they fall over, they rot away, and so on. So the microbial, soil microbes and so on, they have to be present in order to break down that material, oxidize it, and put it back into the nutrients, into the nutrient cycle. And then at the end, plants and things and other organisms interact. So interactions are part of functioning ecosystem. Competition is a function of a forest for light, competition for light, nutrients, and water. So here's the term resilience. Resilience is really resilience is the ability of a forest or a function or an ecosystem to recover from a disturbance. And so if we want to create ecosystems which are resilient, which is a portion of the mandate of recreating our ecosystems, we have to use species and or have functions which allow these ecosystems to recover. So in reclamation, because generally what we want is, let's try to get the vegetation growing as quickly as possible. Companies don't want to wait 100 years or 500 years in order to get the stamp of approval. So we have to accelerate the natural way of recovery, which is primary succession mostly, or secondary succession. So with reclamation, we're trying to help these systems along and moving them quicker. So we plant the trees, we get to the fourth step right away, pretty much. We hop over the first two steps of succession. The other important thing is, in order for our trees to be successful and create the forest conditions, they have to capture the site. So that's what I mean with site capture. The tree canopy has to include or overtop the other vegetation in order to create these conditions which are understory forest conditions. If we don't get the site capture quickly, many of you guys know what we call our weed problems. Okay, so we have other species which are not part of a forest ecosystem which dominate the system and can dominate them for quite some time. So in order to decide what are we going to plant, what are we going to do, I think one of the most important part is that we actually understand what are we planting, what is the species we deal with, or what are the species and what do they do, what do they need. And this is a nice schematic from a paper from Wagner and Cedar quite some time ago. And in that red box is the odd ecology. This is pretty much how a species or species, how they interact with their environment, meaning with other individuals and or with the climate, with nutrients, what kind of site conditions they have. So those are those bubbles on the side, which says phenological stage, growth habits, mode of reproduction, habitat requirements, and so on. If we know more about the species and what they do, and how they respond to these factors, then we can also predict where do those forests go in the future, even if we just planted them. Okay? One big thing is also to identify the key species. We cannot plant them all. There's no way we can plant all our boreal species on boreal reclamation sites. There's no way this is going to happen. There's several people here who collect seeds and plant plants, and we can't do it all. It's not going to happen. So we have to identify key species, which are the species which are truly important for these ecosystems to show these functions we are trying to recreate. Diversity. The diversity is an important factor, not as a species diversity, but as a functional diversity. It is, we have to select species which have certain functions, and there are several species in each ecosystem which are redundant. They have similar functions. So we could pick one of the three or two of the three and say, okay, they fulfill those functions, and we don't have to worry about the third one. Hopefully it comes in on its own. But again, we can't plant them all. And last but not least, as I mentioned before about the site capture, is if we build this canopy, are the understory species follow? Will they establish either on their own, or do we have to help them along? So, luckily we're in the boreal. If I would give that talk in a tropical forest, I would be not sure what to do there. It's about 200 species per hectare. Different tree species I'm talking about. Here we have about 7 in the boreal, 7 to 9 main species. So, okay, we can put that in a fairly good box. But what we need to know is, first of all, can we collect the seeds? How do we collect seeds? How do we get those species? We need to know something about that. We need to know how do we store the seeds, and how can we grow them in nurseries. There's a lot of work just figuring out how to grow these trees. Then we need to know something about how tolerant to stresses they are. Reclamation sites are not nice sites. They're ugly. They're horrible for a plant. You plant a little seedling in the middle of nowhere and you say, yeah, grow. It's not that straightforward for a little guy. So we need to know something about shade, flood, drought, and salt tolerance, for example. And we need to know, if we know which species are more tolerant, can we actually tweak those species and make them a bit more tolerant or less? Okay? So the species we have are what we call early successional species: aspen, balsam, poplar, and birch. And then our conifer species, which are the 2 pines, jack pine and lodgepole pine and tamarack. And then we have late successional species, which we consider late more or less, as white and black spruce and balsam fir. These are our main groups in the boreal. Okay, now I'm getting to my talk. Why focus on aspen? Why did I get so crazy about this species? First of all, it's a beautiful tree. It has characteristics which are making it very unique to many other tree species in the world. Second of all, it has a very wide distribution in North America. If it has a wide distribution, means it can grow on a whole bunch of different sites. It can probably deal with all kinds of different conditions. Otherwise, it wouldn't have a wide distribution. So as a result, it has large genetic variability. There's lots of potential in that species. It's also very adaptable. There's commercial interest, so aspen can be used. It's not preferred necessarily, but it can be used, and OSBs are red and going through the roof again, the prices for it, so it will be more used. And occurs in most of the ecosites. This is the typical mixed wood aspen forest, and theoretically this is what we want to grow on our reclamation sites. If we do that in 80 years, I will be jumping up and down and enjoying. We won't likely, but that is the range. This is aspen from higher elevation. It's more or less similar to what we see in the drought-prone areas on the left side in the prairies. And this is a tree in north of Slave Lake, where you have good moisture and all these kind of things. Nice little pumpkin. So this is the range you can grow aspen. It has a wide expression of the site. It has lots of ability to respond to conditions. One of the cool characteristics about aspen is its root system. Aspen has a very large root system, and you will see pictures of those root systems throughout the talk. But that root system is very special because it is the money in the bank for us for reclaiming and or for managing aspen, because that is where the species is regenerating from. That gives us the resiliency of that species to disturbance. That is where that is the main attractive part about using that species in reclamation. So this is just some information about roots and root systems of aspen. Root systems are, so aspen is clonal. Once the disturbance takes off the, I think I have some nice pictures. Once the disturbance takes off the canopy and it burns, that root system, you get some pictures of there. This is a washed out root system of an aspen stand, and then we take somewhat at different depths, and you get, you see a lot of roots. And all these roots have a potential to sprout and to resucker, and that gives that species the ability to recoup a site which got heavily disturbed, as long as the root system is there. In mining, of course, we remove the root system, so we have to start from scratch. Above ground has some neat characteristics too. It grows fast. If it's a happy plant, it grows fairly fast. It has it throws leaves off every year compared to a spruce. It's very competitive, and the other nice thing is about its canopy allows light to reach the forest floor, which allows other species to establish. Okay? Now, getting back to the root system, as I said, is the unique part of aspen, and we need to understand how important that root system is to the species. And it is, later on I will give some applied parts of why we need to know these things, but I'm just going to give you a quick overview about what's all involved in suckering. It's not a quick process, it just happens, and you know. So the aspen has to actually has to deal with lots of different things. So that's a different picture of a washed out aspen root system. It gives you the idea of what is the potential in the soil. We kind of sometimes forget about it, we just drive over it. Okay, we forget what's actually in the ground, what makes these species to regenerate. So the distribution abundance of that root system, of the mature root system, is driven by all kinds of different attributes. It's driven by soil and site attributes. How deep is the soil? How much moisture is there? How many nutrients, rooting depths, and all those kind of things are important. In the case of management, it's also important, what do we do to the root system? Harvesting in the summer when the ground is moist and thawed is probably not a good idea, because you mash that root system to chunks, and chunks don't regenerate as well as whole root systems. Okay? So ground disturbance. And then you have clonal attributes where we don't really know much about. Is some clones might sucker better than other clones. There's genetic variability which we have very little knowledge about yet. Okay? So once the canopy is cut off, or the trees are cut off, you see these little buds, those little white thingies there. This is where the suckers will arise from. That's the regeneration. This is a bud bank. It's like a branch underground, and then it sprouts from there. Okay? And just the process of building these buds and growing them is also driven by all kinds of variables. We know, for example, that soil nutrients influence the sucker density, how many suckers you get. Aspen likes nitrate better than ammonium. Ammonium is suppressing suckering. Okay? Of course, hormones and genetics play a role in there. Even trees have hormones, not only us when we have bad days. So, and then clone conditions is how healthy is the clone? Is it diseased? Does it have lots of reserves? Has there been lots of wounding to the root system? Things like that. And once those suckers grow, the suckers rely a lot on that old root system, because they don't have their own roots. They resprout from that parent root system. So they need to be supported. So we have, again, clonal conditions. How many reserves are in the root system? Can they support the growth of the suckers? Site conditions again, and other external factors like the moose eating the shoots. Okay. But aspen knows also how to reproduce via seeds. So it occurs. All you guys probably have had the fluff in the spring, tickling your nose or plugging up your radiator in your vehicle. That fluff is widely dispersed, and as a result, aspen is truly, really a weedy species. It has very long distance seed dispersal. You might see in the right top that little speck in the center of that fluff, that little brown speck, that's an aspen seed. The aspen seed is less than 1 millimeter in size. It's tiny. And what you see down there is an aspen seedling germinant. That seedling is 2 days old. The seed germinates within 1 or 2 days. Okay, so the seed is very viable. They germinate very well, but the conditions of germination and for that little seedling to start is very, very important. Okay, so that's one of those points I'm trying to make down there, is that they are small seeds and they have high mortality because the conditions have to be very specific for the seeds to be able to germinate and to continue growing. And because the seed has no reserves, those little cotyledons, those green things, the seed leaves, are truly important for this plant because that's how it gets its energy. It's not going to get its energy from the seed, not like a big acorn, which you like a oak acorn, which you put in the ground and it gets lots of energy from that seed itself. This guy has to go on his or her own. So the thing is, when I started with some of my aspen work, we didn't really know much about aspen seedlings. It was amazing. 20 years ago, there was very little known about how aspen grew from seed. We started growing them for somewhat in the nurseries, but really with the reclamation things, aspen there's now millions of seedlings grown every year for aspen. When I started out, I got barely 100 seedlings from a nursery, so I had to grow them myself, and then I learned how to do it, and so that's how my research came about, because really nobody could tell me how to do it. So I had to learn it myself. So aspen as a natural, this is how they grow. When we seed out aspen in the field, what you get in the first year is a seedling about 1 inch tall. It sits there and you think, oh my, this is not going to do nothing. But when you dig them out in the fall, then you see that they're not doing anything. They're just growing roots and we don't see it. The root-shoot ratio of these guys is 8. That means they have 8 times the root mass below ground than they have above ground. All what it does is get the seedling ready for the next year, which is a year later, and this is now a meter, that stick. That's the root system 1 year later. Okay, and the aspen seedling would have grown 80 centimeters in height. Okay, so it was very deceiving. We thought first, this doesn't work, we don't know what we're doing, but I guess the seedling knows what they're doing, so that's a good thing, and we learned from it. And so we learned from these things, and we decided, okay, can we apply that to nursery stock? Because I've done experiments where I got nursery stock 20 years ago, brought them in a greenhouse, put them in a pot, and you would think you fertilize and water them, and it's all happy, 20 degrees. It would grow. They died in a greenhouse. It's like, whoa, okay, something's not right with our seedlings. So that's how this whole started, is like, can we grow good seedlings for planting stock? Seedlings can be grown from seed, as we already said. Also, they can be grown from cuttings, and then the term seedling doesn't fit quite well, but it's still a planting stock. And we see natural establishment from seed in nature too. We see it on reclamation sites. Also, then we have the asexual reproduction, which we just talked about, the suckering from the root propagule bank and the forest floor. I don't have to talk much about that. So remember, we talked about the initial establishment and site capture. Now I'm going to talk a bit about seedling quality and propagules, about site conditions and other vegetation, how they influence reclamation on reclamation sites. So it's going to be getting a bit more applied now.